Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
We got on a repeat guest today I'm excited about, Adam Butler, who's the turkey program coordinator from Mississippi. Welcome, Adam.
Yeah, man. Good to be back with y'all again.
Yeah, it's always fun, Adam. I always learn something from you. It's always really interesting dialogue. I really enjoy it.
Well, I feel the same way, Marcus. I wasn't gonna, we talked about your gray hair earlier. I want to know, what the difference here. If you'll remember, you and I went to undergrad together, right? So we're roughly the same age, but
yeah, I know. I'm not aging well. I'm not aging well. Hey, I'm holding it though.
Yeah.
I'm keeping it in there.
Dignified, going with the dignified look.
Yeah, the noggin is retaining the hair. It's just turning color.
Yeah, that's probably more important.
He still gets around in the woods pretty good. I only have to usually get his walker out if we hunt up well into the afternoon.
Yeah, depends on the slope and the temperature outside. This wagon will overheat.
Well, I know you were in Mississippi over the weekend. You made a hunt, and it came I was wondering about you. What
gully washer
that was, because I know it came a flood that day. I'm assuming it didn't do any good, huh?
Not much. No turkeys died from my hand, anyway. So, yeah, I heard you went south trying to get around it, I guess.
Yeah, I looked at the radar that morning and thought about you because I know you were in the kind of the northern.
I was right in the heart of it.
Yeah, northern third. It was the whole radar was just a big blob up that way. It looked bad.
So I went out that same morning in West Alabama, and I was guiding a hunter, and we actually got a bird in pretty close. We weren't able to finish it, but it was like one of those deals. I never would have went out if I wasn't guiding somebody, but it was like we had a finite amount of time to try to get this guy on a bird, and so we just went with it, put on the rain gear, and like I said, we couldn't seal the deal. But he gobbled a few times, yeah, even on the ground.
Oh yeah.
So good. We heard him gobble 3 or 4 times, including one time back at us, but ended up getting a hen between us and not able to finish the deal. But it was shocking. I mean, when you're forced to hunt in bad weather, sometimes you realize it may not go exactly the way that you have in your mind.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit better.
I got 2 gobbles after 11. We stuck with it all the way up till noon, and 2 gobbles after 11.
That's tough.
Was it. Yep.
It's tough sledding there.
Didn't get close. Not at all. So.
Of course, it's super anecdotal, but I feel like for whatever reason, this turkey season's been a little off. I mean, I feel like birds have not been as responsive to calling as they should be, especially, around mid-April when a lot of the hens were going to the nest,
Yeah. Well, I would say that has been, at least here in Mississippi, I have almost universally heard that all spring from all corners of our state that for whatever reason, I don't have a really good explanation, but people felt like, turkeys are here. The gobbling activity's just been a little bit off.
We're hearing the same thing across Florida.
Feel like they haven't been able to strike them on up in the morning, that sort of thing. And that's not to say that people haven't had good hunts and all that, but that has been a common comment that I've heard this year.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Marcus.
Well, I was just that was one of the things that we wanted to talk about. And I don't know if you had something you want to interject, Will, before we get into it.
Yeah, one of the things, and this will go ahead and I think knock out one of the questions we'd planned on asking you anyway, Adam, and I'll lead into kind of one of my hypotheses as to why hunting is going the way it is. But y'all had pretty good poult production the past couple of years in Mississippi?
Yeah, we really have. Two years ago was 2022 was one of the better years we've had in a long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
And
In
then
decades, right?
yeah, going back almost to the early 2000s, and then last year, so 2023, most of the state was pretty close to the same level. The northern maybe the very northern quarter of the state did not do as well, but most of the rest of the state did way better than average. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's fair to say that the last 2 years have probably been as good a 2 years as we've had, since the
Mm-hmm.
early 2000s at least.
Yeah, I mean, I've been speculating as to whether or not what we're experiencing has to do with something related to just more overall birds, total birds on the landscape. Because I've heard lots of gobbling in the mornings, but it's been very limited in the number of gobbles. Like, so you hear individual birds and locations
Yeah.
more than normal, but they don't, they're not gobbling as frequently on an individual basis. But anyway, I was wondering if it may have to do with the overall number of birds increasing, or maybe, even having more jennies. Like, I wonder if like having more jennies in the mix could
Yeah,
mess things up.
I definitely could buy that. And totally anecdotal. I mean, that doesn't take a scientist to know. If there's more hens in the woods, gobblers are going to be henned up more, and they're going to be
Hmm.
less likely to gobble. But I've noticed over the years, like hunting properties that have a lot of turkeys, especially if it's really light hunting pressure. Sometimes you can run into that too, where
Hmm.
it just every gobbler out there gets henned up, and
Hmm.
you
Yeah,
end up
they're
not
all
hearing
with
this.
hens.
Yeah.
That's been kind of my experience all season, really. I don't know if I've gotten on a gobbler that didn't have some hens with him.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
So, and but so when you were talking a few minutes ago, you were saying that people, are expressing they're not hearing much gobbling, but they're still relatively successful. That's kind of brought up to me. I was wondering, what does the harvest look like this year?
Well, we estimate harvest, or what I say estimate. I've got kind of two numbers. So we
Yeah, yeah.
have here game check, mandatory harvest reporting, and unlike a lot of the rest of the country, we're kind of late comers to that game where hunters here have only been required to report their harvests by law since the 2019 season. So this is only the sixth year, I guess, or fifth, sixth year of us having mandatory harvest data. So that data set, which is instantaneous, we're running well above what we have the last 5 years, the previous 5 years.
Oh,
Wow.
We're already about 2,000 birds above what the best of the previous five had been. So if you want to look at it, kind of the average of those 5 years prior to this year, we're about 15 to 20% up.
Right.
So
oh wow.
really good. You know, the number that we have that's kind of apples to apples comparison to the past is our postseason estimate, which we probably won't have done until uh, maybe 1st of July or so. So it'll be really
Yeah.
interesting to look at that. That last year that number was up a good bit. It was one of the better years we've had in a couple of decades. So um,
In
you
a
know,
couple of decades. Wow.
yeah, so I think last year our estimated harvest was like 36,000 and some change, and that was the first time we had broken that since probably 2003 or four, somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
Got to that
Hmm.
that range. So,
Yeah.
um, so good season, and like I said, it's been really interesting because I have obviously I've not talked to every single hunter, but most of the people I've talked to is very similar story to what you're saying, where the gobbling activity has not been normal, but people are still tagging birds, they're still reporting birds, so it
Mm-hmm.
looks good.
Hmm. I choose to believe that. Well, never mind. We won't go into that. I was gonna say while they're killing
Let's
birds,
keep it on
while they're
Turkeysville.
killing
Can we
birds,
keep it focused
and
here?
I'm not killing birds, but that's just an excuse, not a reason, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's really interesting, Adam, because there's, I think several other states are having really good years this year as well, and I know some hunters are attributing that to regulation changes that have been made in various states over the past several years. Each of them are handling that a little bit differently, but you're saying the same thing in Mississippi. if I'm correct, has not really made any major regulation changes in the recent past. Is that right?
No, we not nothing major on the spring season for sure, as far as frameworks or anything like that.
Yeah, when can you describe the season? Like, when does it start? What's the bag limit? And
We start March 15th and run to May the 1st, and we've been kind of on March 15th since 2005.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, since beginning in about 1980, our season started on the Saturday closest to March the 20th and ran to May the 1st. If you go back before 1980, like it gets a little hard to tie together because that was still during sort of the restoration phase, and you had a sort of a hodgepodge of regulations. But sort of
mhm,
1980 was kind of when we hit sort of a statewide framework.
yeah.
And
So when you moved it in the early 2000s, it was what, a few days later on average,
earlier, it was a few
or
days
early?
earlier. So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
went from
I
the
meant
Saturday, yeah,
the
the Saturday
1980
closest to the
season
20th.
was
Yeah,
a few days later than now on average.
Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah. Okay.
But it could fluctuate because it was a Saturday opener. So
Yeah. Yeah.
some years were only a couple of days different from what we're at
Right.
now. Some years might have been up to like a week different.
Okay.
But anyway, from 2005 to today, it's roughly been March 15th to May 1st, with a 3-bird bag limit.
Mm-hmm.
So in
So,
terms of your nesting chronology, what where is that? Where's your start date in relation to like the beginning of laying and the beginning of incubation?
yeah, we've got a lot of historic data, going all the way back
Hmm.
to the really the late 70s. Some of the first telemetry studies here were done in the late 70s. A lot of stuff through the 80s and 90s, and then more recently, we've done a few things with some GPS stuff and all that. So if you look at nesting dates, our dates are pretty similar to what kind of the standard of the Southeast is, where nesting starts. Uh, the first the second week of April, something like that is kind of what you think. And then incubation is going to be, somewhere between April 15th and April 25th in there,
Mm-hmm.
kind of when the
Hmm.
mean incubation would be. So pretty similar to what most studies in the South are going to show.
Right.
Yeah, that's what
So
I was thinking.
yeah, so y'all seasons are still kind of structured the same way that most of the Southeast was up until up a few years ago.
Right.
Um, so given that y'all have not made any changes, what is it that you attribute this, increase, or what you think or projecting is going to be an increase in harvest to? You think it's more of like regional
Well, it
weather
is. Yeah, it's
trends,
in
or
reproduction as well, right? I mean, your brood
Yeah, well, yeah,
surveys
right.
are.
So I think we're having a really good year this year in 2024 because we had just a huge hatch in 2022.
Mhm.
Now, why we all of a sudden had a huge hatch in 2022, I think, sort of the $6 million question. We could talk about weather and stuff like that, and it was, 22 was a good spring weather wise, but I don't know to what degree that played. To what
Hmm.
degree that played in. We do also have some specific things here, like some of our best turkey habitat here is along the Mississippi River, and like the real just the edge of the river, the margin of the river, what we call the Batcher, which is behind the levee, and that area, man, from about 2009 up until just a few years ago was just repeatedly hammered with flooding. And now we've had several years in a row where the river hasn't flooded or hasn't had a
Hmm.
major flood in the
Mhm.
spring. So some of those things are very understandable why those areas all of a sudden are doing really well,
Mhm.
and those areas are some of our most productive areas. But it's broader than just that,
Yeah, I
So
was going to say that's a really small
yeah,
proportion of the state,
yeah.
so
So
that
Yeah.
can
there's
explain it.
there's some there's some local things you can kind of pick and choose to say, well, we're probably in a little bit better place today than we might have been 10 years ago in this area or that area. But on the whole, I don't know. It's one of those. I mean, it's why we need some wild turkey science, I guess. We got to figure out, what is the thing that really drives the hatch at really broad scales, and I don't know that we fully have our head around that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't remember if Marcus and I have talked about this on the air before. I mean, maybe we've mentioned it in passing, but it bears repeating. that we've had conversations with scientists in the Southeast and a couple different states though that noted that during one particular year where they had, these are independent research projects with birds tagged in separate states that experienced a increase or a notable increase in reproduction during 1 year on their study sites at the same time. So it really speaks to that synchrony that you can have between poor and good hatch years at a regional scale. I think that's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah, Adam, along those lines, who compares best to you? Is it Alabama or Arkansas or Louisiana, Tennessee? I know they're surrounding states, but do you
In
like?
terms
Can
of
you?
the trends, or just looking at that, I mean, I would.
Yeah, I was just thinking like productivity over time from the pulp per hen or harvest. Like, or do you see trends like that across the neighboring
Yeah, when
states?
we get together, as you guys know, like all the turkey biologists in the South, we usually get together once a year. In the summertime, at least in the Southeast, we usually have a June meeting, and you can look at one region of a state compared to the region of the state next door, and usually see patterns there.
Mm-hmm.
Like Southeast Louisiana, uh, usually their brood data and stuff like that pair up pretty well to like our southeast region, Southeast
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi, and so you see some, you do see some broad patterns, I think, across the region like that. A lot of the states, Arkansas, Mississippi, that have the same issue I was mentioning about the Mississippi River. It's the same in all of those
Mm-hmm.
states. I'm sure West Tennessee's probably the same deal, where you've got a lot of those lands that flood, and they're dealing with
Yeah.
that. At the statewide level, I guess us and Alabama are very similar in terms of kind of the composition of the state habitats across the state.
Mm-hmm.
That'd probably be who we were the most close to in terms of probably what turkey habitat looks like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we harvest a very similar number of birds in
Yes.
Mississippi and
Yes.
Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
We've been around 35,000 a year in recent
Yes.
history.
Yeah, and that, to me, that's comparable, because the one major difference between Mississippi and Alabama is, you know, Alabama's a little bit bigger, I think, in terms of overall land area, but
Yeah, I think
then
it's like a
the
couple million acres difference, like 30
yeah,
versus
but
32 or something
in
like
our
that.
state, in Mississippi, the Delta region of our state, which is sort of the northwest part of the state, is largely void of turkeys. The interior part of the Delta, because it's
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
essentially all
Intensive agriculture.
horizon to horizon farmland with very
Mm-hmm.
little forest. So you've probably got 10 million acres in Mississippi that's largely not suitable for turkeys. And so if you were to take that same amount from Alabama, I think the harvest numbers match up very well between those two.
That sounds like an excuse, Adam.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We're,
So
we're man. When you're from Mississippi, we're always last in everything, so we had to have some.
You
yeah,
gotta hang on to something,
got
right?
to have something.
Right.
So I mean, it's curious to me, given that the season structures and even some of the seasons have been changed in structure, but you're still seeing those patterns, right? Those patterns in productivity and patterns in harvest are still
Yeah, I think that's
similar.
fair. I mean, and there are differences, and I think there's gradients when you look at the pulp per hen stuff. Going south to north, but I think there are broad patterns there, and it's one of those things I don't think we really fully understand. If you look at other game birds, I always think um, I think about with turkeys, I think about ruffed grouse, which are fairly closely taxonomically related, and
Mhm.
they're known to just classically cycle across big swaths of their
Well,
range.
that's
That
something that you said to me last time on when we were on the air, and I don't remember what episode that was, but Charlotte can link the episode if folks don't remember this. But you were talking about populations that are stable.
Mhm.
You could expect them to have ebbs and flows that during a I forgot exactly what, and you can remind me if you know what it is, but you could have a peak and a lull in the population over like a 10-year period that might be 50% difference or something.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think in turkeys that's well
that's the
established in the literature that they're going to swing that
yeah.
widely, just
Well,
sort of naturally.
it
But
seems like, but it seems like a bunch of states, yours and ones around it, kind of we went through this decline, right, where we kind of got to a low, but now it seems like it's on the upslope in all of them, right?
yeah, and
So
I don't know,
it's
the
sort
other,
is it cycling like that? Like to me, that's what it looks like, and I was just curious,
yeah, I would
what you
love to
thought.
know that. I wonder that a lot because again, there's so many other game birds where that is pretty well established in the
Yeah.
science and in the literature that they are going to be cyclical. And like in the case of ruffed grouse, I don't know that anybody fully understands why that cycle happens. I think there's several
Hmm.
different kind of competing theories on why that happens, but it's just openly accepted that it happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I
You
think
look at
you got two things. Is that what we're well? I guess three things actually. Is that what we're seeing now? Is that actually happening in the population, and then why is it happening in the population? I guess we have, a few questions. Is that what we're observing? Does that happen in the species, and then
sure,
why does it
right,
happen if it's happening?
right, yeah. So all three of those questions are largely unanswered, but
Yeah.
to me, it I could see where that could be a possibility.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, that's going
Yeah.
on. And with turkeys particularly, it's not been long enough since restocking to really probably detect a lot of that. I
Right.
mean,
Hmm.
But
there's a
Marcus,
lot of states that it's only been the last 15 years that they kind of wrapped up 15, 20 years that they wrapped up, restoration. So we're not in a lot of the country, we're not very far post uh, that being
Right.
done.
yeah.
Whereas Mississippi's a little farther along that timeline
Yeah,
than quite a
that is
few
one
other
thing I
places.
brag on. We were an early state in the restoration process, which a lot of the Deep
Good for
South
you.
was. But
I'm glad you've got something, Adam. You got to hold
hey,
on to
that's a
something.
good thing to have. Good thing to have.
You got your priorities in the right place.
Yeah, I
Right,
like it.
right.
What were
Um,
you about to say, Will? I
well,
think we.
that reminded me. I'll get back to what I was about to say, but you reminded me talking about that just now. For folks that didn't listen the first time Adam came on, and I suggest you go back and listen to that episode because he talked about a really cool study that Mississippi funded several years ago that was related to season dates and some metrics of hunter satisfaction and hearing gobbling and things like that on WMAs, and that was a really interesting project that they recently completed. But then the other thing that I was going to mention to you, Marcus, is and Adam, I'm sure you're well aware of this too because you kind of stay up to date on the turkey literature. But I mean, I don't, if we're looking at changes in turkey vital rates before or after something or in response to something, I generally don't trust it until you've got about 3 years of reproductive data because it just varies so much, oscillates
Hmm.
from year to year by such a significant margin that if you just do like a before after with only 1 or 2 years of data on either side of that, you can make some very faulty assumptions that actually weren't related to what you're looking at, but rather
Hmm.
just natural annual variation in turkey reproduction.
Yeah, that's a good point, Will. And the other thing along those lines, like it's hard to compare across studies if they're not done at the same time. If they're cycling that much,
Absolutely.
if you compare the productivity of this study to 5 years later on a different site, like they may be substantially different just because of that.
That's right. Just depending on the snapshot in time that window included.
Mm.
Um, but moving on, Adam, another thing that we wanted to ask you about is, we talked last time a little bit about non-residents in Mississippi. Obviously, a huge destination state, especially now that some of the states around it are starting a little bit later. So, what have you seen relative to that in Mississippi?
We've always been a popular destination state because Mississippi opens early and we have a rich spring tradition and all those things. But it is absolutely escalated in the last few years, which it's not just non-resident. I mean, turkey hunting in general has just gotten a lot more popular
Hmm.
across the board. But we beginning about about 5 years ago, really started to see an increase in non-residents, and then kind of after the COVID year, it just went exponential, and we got to looking at a lot of our non-resident numbers, and they essentially doubled in about a 3-year period, beginning in 2020.
What was
So
that concentrated early in the season? Like, is it
yes,
when
it
your
was. So
season's
we can
open
look
and the
at
other ones aren't?
we we can look at the license type the non-resident buys, whether they're buying a annual license or a short, like a 7-day short stay license, and most all of those are coming during that first couple of weeks. So
Mhm.
you talked about changes early. The only change of note, I guess, in terms of the spring season that we made recently was to try to preserve sort of spring hunting quality on some of our public lands in lieu of the influx of non-residents we've gotten. So we did go to a non-resident draw on all public lands prior to April 1st,
Mhm.
and this is the third year of that, I think, if I
Yeah.
remember right.
So
Um,
how many
so
years when you said it doubled? You said like 3 or 4 years of that.
we had a relatively stable non-resident um, for years and years and years. The number was relatively stable. It didn't really fluctuate by a lot.
Mm,
And then beginning in about 2019, and then really in 2020, that number started going vertical almost. And by 2022, uh, it had almost doubled from what it had kind of been for the mean over several years prior. So that was what kind of prompted us to say, look, we got an issue here. It's a you don't want to discourage non-residents. We want to be welcoming to everybody, but we really have a situation here where um, we've seen a tremendous increase in demand. Um, we're in kind of this situation where we're about the only place in the country to go during those couple of weeks. And so we felt like we needed to put just some safeguards on there to preserve kind of hunting quality on our public
mhm.
lands. And so it's worked well. We really didn't receive a whole lot of, even most of the non-residents, we didn't receive a whole lot of bad comments back on that. I think a lot of folks realized the situation and
Mhm.
have accepted it. I hate it for folks that want to come here and don't get drawn for that early season endorsement, but it was just sort of our way to try to keep the pot from boiling over. Knowing
Yeah,
that
I know it makes
Mhm.
we kind of in
sense.
this situation. So
No, I think that's an important, safeguard to make sure that you maintain a quality of hunting experience for your residents. You have to always take care of, resident hunters
yeah,
first and
yeah,
Yeah.
while
I mean, I think
recommend.
all states are kind
Yeah.
of trending that way.
But even though you put that in place, what's interesting to me is that you were saying in 22 in particular is when that
I'm trying. I may have said that
number
it may have been
spiked.
21. It went into that. Yeah, yeah. So it was the 21 season was the year that we really saw like 2020, 2021 were the 2 years that we saw the number just really go through the roof. And then
Mhm.
that was the
So
time
would it
around the time where we also due to framework changes in other states, we realized, okay, going forward, it's going to be even worse than it has been because
Right.
so
just sort of the situation. So I think 2022 was the first year we put in the non-resident draw. So that's right. This is the third year of it. So
yeah,
2022, 23, 24.
yeah.
So
So
Gotcha.
so you had really I'm trying to put that together. I mean, I think 2020 was the record harvest for most states, wasn't it? When it was really
I think a
high,
lot of
the
states, yeah,
harvest
that's probably
because
fair.
of the
That a lot
COVID.
of states saw big jumps in harvest.
Yeah, I don't think
Yeah,
it was
on that year.
necessarily a record from historic records, but at least
Right,
in the
right.
near
Yeah,
term, harvest
you're
spiked up
right.
a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
that's
here,
good
I'm
contextually.
trying, yeah, you catching me off guard, but 2020 was a pretty solid year harvest wise here, if I remember right. But it wasn't like outside the norm. But now, like the way
Yeah.
COVID happened, we were already well underway with our
Mhm.
turkey season before a lot of things started shutting down for COVID.
Yeah.
So it affected
Oh,
us
that's interesting.
differently. Yeah, it would have affected us differently than it would have affected a state in the West or something like that,
Yeah.
or a state further north. Um,
But for other reasons, at least from the non-resident hunting pressure, it almost doubled.
Yeah, over a couple year period. But again, like
Yeah.
we got
So, but you
we've
still
also
had
so we've
yeah, but,
seen a big increase in turkey hunters across the board. I mean, even
right.
residents, but
Okay.
the non-resident thing is the situation we felt like we had to address
Yeah.
just because.
Well, it is interesting that all that pressure has been concentrated early in the season, and you still saw really good Holt numbers
Yeah.
in those years.
Yeah, definitely in 22. And again, man, it's mystery of the universe
We're
why 22 was so good. I mean, I think there were some things about that spring that lined up really well. Again, just from a weather standpoint, and the 2020 hatch had been
yeah.
pretty good, so you probably had a lot of adult hens coming into that spring, or proportionally more adult hens. But it was just head and shoulders above anything else, and I don't really have a great answer for why.
Right.
Well, that's one of the things I was thinking. If you look at it from a broader scale, and you got multiple states involved, they're all doing things differently, but they're still correlated in these metrics. Like, it just screams to me that there's something broader affecting this cycle in the population that you're seeing across state lines, like weather, or I don't know, pathogen cycles, or something that's some sort of
Yeah,
natural process that's causing this cycling that you were talking about. And I found that really, really interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it's something that we have to be careful of too, because I do see where there are some states that have made changes to their season structure or bag limits that are seeing the same thing that's being seen in Mississippi right now, with poult per hen ratios going up. And they're saying, cause and effect. They're saying that, oh, those reg changes are what increased reproduction. But in this case, Mississippi is kind of serving as a control in a case study, right? Showing us like, no, we didn't change anything related to our season structure, and we're kind of seeing the same thing. So
Mm.
instead, that leads me to shift to the alternative hypothesis that there's something going on at a broader scale that may be related to any of those factors that Marcus just
Mm.
brought up, instead of necessarily what's going on with seasons.
Yeah, in fact, you even had a higher pressure early in the season, during those years. So,
yeah. And
yeah,
I don't. I
really
mean,
interesting.
and I don't know that we should just absolutely hang our hat on a year or two, but if we're 5 years from now, can look at kind of what happened over this time frame and
Hmm.
and have a better handle on what's going on.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, and,
for
and
sure.
that's back to the point I made earlier, is that we have to be careful because turkey reproduction is just so cyclical. But my point was that we really can't assign causation to that yet.
Yeah, I'm with you. Well, another thing, Adam, again, sort of tweaking the subject line. I know you're getting it, and it's probably why you wrote the article recently for the Gamekeepers magazine. We're getting it a lot, especially in the last few weeks. People want to know how to make decisions at their at a different scale. So we've been talking about kind of at statewide scales now, and all that. But what about on individual properties? I get maybe I'll frame it as the question that I get a lot, and that I assume prompted you to write that recent article, is how many gobblers should I harvest? If
Yep.
I'm just the landowner that has several hundred acres or thousand acres to hunt on, how am I making the decision of how many I can harvest?
Yeah, and I get. I mean, reason that article in Gamekeepers felt like I wanted to write is because that is a really common question that people ask. And usually it's like it's similar to what you described. It's a landowner or a hunting club that has some amount of land, but not just not enormous acreages.
Hmm.
And so they're thinking about carryover. They're thinking about how many birds they have. They're wanting to be good stewards of that resource to ensure they have good hunting down the road. And so they're asking, how many should it take? And the the problem with that question, even though that's really, I mean, if you think about it, that's a fundamental of wildlife management. I mean, you think about all the different things that we do for wildlife, managing harvest uh, is right there. It's one of the primary
Hmm.
reasons our profession exists. But for turkeys, that is such a difficult question when you get to the property level. And to me, it's even a different set of decisions. When I'm sitting here as the state agency turkey biologist thinking about the whole of Mississippi, I'm thinking about populations. I'm thinking about how does harvest affect the population of turkeys across the state. At the property level, unless you're really, really blessed, I mean, there are probably a few. There's some number of people out there that probably have enough land that can actually ask a population question when it comes to turkeys, but most people can't. Most people are not going to have enough acreage where they're dealing with that number of birds. So they're thinking at a smaller scale. They're thinking about the number of birds I have out there now, whatever that is, and how can I be sure I've got that many for next year. And man, it's tough. It's really, really, really tough to frame up an answer with any kind of backing at that scale. And I think a lot of people, especially if you're familiar with deer management, you can kind of say that, especially with antlerless deer management. And I guess I should say too, I'm talking from a perspective of the Deep South and Mississippi. So I have no idea if what I say really translates well to the Midwest or other parts of the country. But here, with deer management, if you've got a property, let's say a hunting club that's 1,000 acres or something, they own or lease or whatever. If you know the area they're in, you sort of know the physiographic region, how productive it is, habitat types, soil types, all that sort of stuff. If you're familiar with it, you can kind of give them a ballpark antlerless recommendation that's reasonable to sort of maintain the population where it is, And here in our state, that's going to vary. A lot of Mississippi, a doe per 100 acres might kind of be a good starting place. As we get closer to the Mississippi River and you get into more productive soils, it might be a doe per 50 or even a higher harvest rate than that in some places, really, really high, really productive populations. And so with deer, there's there is this sort of standard kind of recommendations you can give based on the property. Turkeys, it doesn't work too good because they're so erratic. Just like you were saying, Will, you've got so much variability, it gets really difficult. But it's still a common question, that people want to know.
Right. Yeah.
Well, you can't even uniquely identify them very easily. So,
right.
That's one thing that you've got with deer.
And the other thing too is, with does, and deer, you can pretty much say that, on good range, a doe is going to, give birth to twin fawns in most years. Whereas with a hen turkey, that can, in a given year, it can range, from 0 or over a period of time, rather not a given year. It can range from 0 and then, maybe 1 year, she hatches out and broods 10 poults, right?
Right.
I mean, huge difference up and down. And then the other thing that's kind of unique to this whole dynamic is that with deer, we're intentionally harvesting females to control population size.
Right.
But with turkeys, harvest, within reason, right? We don't want to kill all the males before they breed. Obviously, that would disrupt breeding. But within reasonable limits, we don't really have any evidence that gobbler harvest is impacting reproduction. So we're thinking more about what is going to be our carryover to make sure that we have a huntable population in the next year.
Right. And I think when landowners ask that question, I think that's kind of where they're coming from.
Exactly.
They're thinking of it in terms of a carryover question. How many should I take, or how many should I leave so that I know next year? And again, like the problem with that, not a problem with that, but the difficulty with that is the hatch could make the floor fall out from under you next year, or you get a 2022 year and all of a sudden, there's just tons and tons more turkeys just seemingly out of nowhere. And so it makes it really tough to pin down what a sustainable, if you even want to call it that, what a sustainable harvest per area would be across a property,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do think, that within a property too, though, there's other factors to consider that make sense at the property scale that don't necessarily maybe make sense at a larger scale, or that are difficult to scale up. So like an example that I use, personal example I use, I'm blessed to have a few places to turkey hunt, and one of those places is my grandfather's property. My cousin and I share that property. We hunt that property, and we sort of have a gentleman's agreement on how many turkeys we're going to take out there. If he takes his one, he's going to kind of back off so that I can go take one. And it's not so much like that sort of thinking that we're kind of controlling the harvest at the property level. It's not. We're not really doing that because that's going to have way more turkeys 5 years from now. We're doing that because, were I to roll out there on the opening day of the season and try to kill my state bag limit 3 as quickly as I could out there, he may very well kind of be in a place where he's going to have less hunting quality as a result. There's not going to be as many on the property. There're not going to be as many around. He's going to have, a lower quality season as a result. So we're kind of working out, harvest management thoughts on a property level, not really because we think that that's going to make or break us for years to come. It's really more about how are we going to slice the pie within this 1 year. However big the pie is, we can either eat a couple of big pieces or maybe split up a lot of small pieces. But how are we going to slice that pie up within a given season so that we can all sort of share the standing crop of turkeys?
Yeah.
And that sort of thinking makes a lot of sense, I think, at a property level, particularly if you've got a property that's having to be shared by a lot of people. But that's not really, that's not necessarily dictating how many turkeys you're going to have years and years to come.
Right.
Yeah, it's not necessarily affecting how many poults get recruited. It's more about we've got some finite number of adult gobblers, and we can kill some proportion of them, and we'll still have some of those same adult gobblers next season.
Right, and when you think about it at the larger scales, I mean, certainly the season structure can dictate carryover to some degree, the proportion of gobblers that are going to get killed or not get killed. But what ends up happening is the hatch sort of has such an outsized effect. Whatever the difference in carryover from year to year is going to be dwarfed by the hatch, whether it's a good hatch or a bad hatch. A good hatch, just cures everything, and a bad hatch is almost impossible to overcome with gobbler carryover. So that's why, with turkeys, it doesn't really work the way it works with deer, where like you said, Will, I mean, you can kind of expect constant reproduction with deer for the most part. I mean, they might, over a long period, they're going to trend.
It varies much to a much lesser degree. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But I mean, even with the season framework thing, Marcus, as we just talked about several weeks ago with Patrick Whiteman, they looked at, gobbler survival over a number of states with various, varying frameworks in terms of both bag limit and season date, and they found that the actual survival rates of gobblers was remarkably consistent.
Yeah, across
those
states.
sites. Yeah.
And it was averaging about 30%, right? So, Adam, that one of the questions I wanted to inject here. First of all, did you get your turkey off your place down there you're sharing?
Well, no, I've
still after him.
Yeah, I've the state of Mississippi allows me to get one more, but like I said, on my family place there, we've been kind of saving those turkeys for the kids. So I've not actually personally hunted there.
Okay.
Except we're taking.
So you can still got that one.
Yeah.
You still got that one.
Yeah.
Well, on a more serious note, I guess part of this is it's hard to know how many gobblers you have on your property.
Yeah,
but let's just say that somebody has 1,000 acres and they think they have 10 gobblers. Like they figured out, I think I've got about 10. So what do you suggest, on average, what are you thinking about when you're determining how many of those 10 you're willing to take?
So first of all, I'd be very skeptical that for sure you have 10. And there's a whole, you probably make a whole episode on what we don't know about being able to count turkeys. But one of the things we've got, one of the data sets we've got to look at some of this is our Avid Hunter Survey, where we have hunters recording observations for us in the field. And you can look at that. You can from that you can look at the ratio of jakes to adult gobblers people see. And over time here, it averages out where about 55% of all observations are adult gobblers, about 45% are jakes. And that fluctuates a little bit if you compare those two. But the jake proportion rarely ever goes below about 35% of all observations. So like in a really bad year where you've had a bad hatch, you're going to have fewer jakes next year. But if you look at it at a broad scale, still, even with that, about 35% of all the male turkey observations are going to be jakes. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So jakes are sort of the next year's buffer, right? The buffer of this year's harvest for next year, right? So if you think about it that way, then, even in the worst of times, you should be safe taking about a third of the adult gobblers and still being reasonably sure there's going to be enough jakes coming along, assuming and again, I guess I should say, here in Mississippi, jakes are not legal for harvest. So when I'm talking about that, I'm not really factoring jake harvest into the equation. Youth hunters can shoot jakes here, but for the most part, it's insignificant. And even in most of the rest of the country, where hunters can legally shoot jakes, most of all the harvest research, even the study you cited a second ago, shows that for the most part, jakes are not getting killed.
So just to make sure I'm on the same page as you, you're saying that in the worst years, 30-something% of all of the male birds in an area are going to be jakes, so that we know that if we take out that many birds, we'll have at least that many 2-year-olds the following year to backfill.
Correct. That's what the
sense.
observational data we're getting from hunters would suggest, that even in the worst reproduction years, the following spring, you're still going to have roughly a third of the male turkeys that are being observed, or a little more than a third, like mid 30s, are going to be jakes. Now, like any data set, there's going to be bias with that. Okay, so it's observational data. Those ratios are probably not exact because the number of adult gobblers is steadily dwindling throughout the season, whereas the number of jakes is probably staying consistent.
Sure.
Well, what
again,
I was going to say,
starting place.
Yeah,
right?
what I was going to say, Adam, that there's issues, but it's also consistent with that really big study we had Patrick on to talk about. Really big sample size, good study across the South. On average, 30% are being taken.
Yeah.
Across
and that
all
was
these
30.
states.
So in that study, that was 30% of the adult gobblers, right? Not 30% of all gobblers, which is an important distinction to make.
But like you said, the jakes aren't really getting harvested that much. So
yeah.
But the other thing that also is consistent with the historical modeling that was done, that was sort of projecting what level, that wasn't about reproduction either. It was about harvesting
carryover.
males. Yeah, so that you have a nice carryover, so hunter satisfaction is maintained. And they said about a third, right?
Right. Yeah. I think the study that gets held up a lot was done in Missouri back in the 80s, where they sort of suggested the harvest rate. And they were talking about all birds, and not just adult gobblers, but all male birds. The harvest rate should not exceed about 30% of the population.
To maintain
because
hunter
if you did that,
satisfaction.
you did that, you would eventually, like, the population would begin to be skewed away from adult birds, which is a hunter satisfaction thing.
But we're well below that in most states now, because even in many states that still don't have, where jakes are still legal for harvest, hunters are voluntarily restricting their harvest to adult birds in many cases.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's just a fraction of the total birds harvested in most states.
That's right. So I guess going back to like the hypothetical, you think you got 10 gobblers. I mean, I think even in the worst of years, conceivably, you should be able to take about a third of those and feel confident that there should be enough jakes somewhere around that it's going to replace, what you lost there. And in a really high reproduction year, the proportion of jakes would be even higher, right? So like I said, the long-term average in that data set, that observational data set, is that jakes average about 40. It's close to half and half. It's roughly about 45% jake.
Mm-hmm.
So again, thinking about
Yeah.
that.
Well, to kind of summarize that, we don't have a very good way to count turkeys, and they're hard to count for lots of reasons. But if you have a good idea, and you think you do, of how many gobblers you have, about a third of them should be replaced by jakes, and that's about what we're doing across the landscape, and what the modeling showed years ago would maintain hunter satisfaction.
Right. The trouble is that figuring out exactly how many you have, because that's not easy to do. And and the other thing is, even if we could estimate it really, really well and be very precise with that estimate, if your estimate was taken in December, it's a good chance the turkeys you counted might be 5 miles away by the 1st of April. So that's the other problem, is that they move so much, especially when they're shifting from kind of that winter to spring range. They can, not every turkey makes big moves, but a lot of them can and
that's
do.
A good point.
Yeah,
just more complexity.
Yeah, and so if a hunter's sitting there thinking, I feel like I hunted all deer season and think I've got this many gobblers. Well, X number of those are probably not going to be there in the spring, but you may be picking up gobblers from somewhere else that are moving too. So it's really tough to get that answer of how many should I take off my place is sort of the point.
Mm-hmm.
So one other thing and I know we got to wrap this thing up in just a second, but the one other thing I wanted to touch on briefly before we do is, all three of us, I think, talk to hunters all over the place all the time that, on good properties, low performing properties, and everywhere in the middle. So I can say personally that I see hunters that talk about sustainable harvest, meaning they've done this consistently year after year, that harvest anything from as high as one bird per 100 acres on an annual basis, all the way up to one bird per 600 acres on an annual basis, and view that as sustainable. Adam, what has been
have been doing that for more than a decade,
right?
In a couple of cases that I know of.
Right, Adam, what has been your experience with that?
So we've got some numbers on that. If you look like statewide, we average. Well, let me say this way: so those hunters that participate in that same observational study, some of them participate as hunting clubs. So we kind of know what's coming off a given piece of ground, knowing how big it is and all of that. And the average is about a bird per 500 acres, which I think is, I think a lot of people would think that's low. That doesn't sound like a lot of turkeys, a bird per 500 acres, but that's kind of what is average. But now, like you said, Will, within that, there's some that do a lot better than that. If you look at kind of the upper 75th percentile, you're talking probably half of that. So a bird per 250. And then there's properties that go even higher than that. A bird per 100 acres or 150 acres or something on some of the very high end, top notch places.
And if they have really great habitat and high productivity, they might have a lot more jakes replacing those gobblers, and they're able to sustain that higher intensity.
Right. But it's hard. So those are averages, and it's hard even within the averages to figure out where to land, because like I said, not every property is going to be exactly the same. And then some properties are going to change, by the year, you may have a really good year and a really, sometimes not. And even within properties, a lot of times you see most of the turkeys a lot of times it's common for a lot of the turkeys to be harvested on a relatively small part of a bigger property. And so if you're, if you've got 40 acres, but you got the right 40 acres, you may be kind of the hub of where all the local gobblers are hanging out.
Right.
So when you start talking about harvest per area, it gets really tricky because of all of those things,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot to think about. So, I think kind of the takeaway from this is, try to play it conservative. If you're going to change anything up, don't make huge changes all at once. And then, maybe just adjust from there accordingly. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And if you're worried, then be conservative. If you're making I'll never fault anybody at the property level for being conservative on a property if they value having turkeys out there. I mean, I think we're continuing to understand how harvest affects turkey populations, and I think there's over the last several years been a realization that we've got a lot of knowledge gaps there, and I think science is filling in some of those gaps. But if you're managing the family farm or whatever, kind of go with your gut, and if you're not comfortable killing more turkeys, then stop.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy to control that at the property level. But keep in mind, that the things that are probably determining the number of turkeys in the overall landscape are really big picture things in a lot of cases. And you need to do everything you can on your place to make your piece of dirt be the most attractive for a turkey in that neighborhood, but also knowing that the factors that are really determining the number of turkeys are happening, way beyond your borders most of the time.
Yeah, which, I mean, that's great stuff. And I mean, I think it really drives home this point that we've been talking about several times recently, which is try to work with your neighbors and try to, increase that management out until you actually are, containing or managing within a entire population and not just a segment of a population.
Right.
But yeah, good stuff. Marcus, do you have anything else?
Nope. I gotta run, guys. Been really fun, really enjoyable conversation as always, Adam.
Yeah, well, appreciate you guys having me back on.
Glad you could speak directly to that, because I know a lot of people really care about turkeys and really want to know how they can be a good steward. So appreciate that.
Absolutely. And man, I'll say it here, and I've said this a lot lately. I mean, whatever the ebbs we've been through in recent years with turkeys, I think the silver lining to it is there's just so much more interest now than ever. And there's just so much more interest in people wanting to manage and like I said, make their ground the best that it can be for the birds. And I think all that's, I'm optimistic about where we're headed in the turkey world because of all of that.
Great.
Awesome. Me too. Appreciate it, Adam.
All right. Yeah, thanks everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate all the support. Thanks, guys, for taking some time, but I guess we go.
All right. See ya. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.